Loess Hills, Iowa, October, 1879. The air held the crisp, mineral scent of coming frost, and the cottonwoods along the creek had surrendered their gold. In the small settlement carved into the rolling landscape, the rhythms of autumn were absolute: the final harvest, the stacking of firewood, the chinking of log walls against the coming winter. But on Constantin Florescu's plot, a different rhythm was at work, one that drew stares, then whispers, then open mockery. He had torn out the floor of his cabin, not to replace the rough-hewn planks with better ones, but to replace them with nothing at all. For weeks, he had been hauling buckets of a specific greasy clay from a cut bank a mile away, mixing it with sand and straw in a shallow pit. Now, he was inside the cabin, methodically tamping this damp gray mixture into the excavated space where his floor had been, his movements steady and patient. Ward Pickett, the owner of the lumber mill and a man whose opinions were as solid as his oak beams, stood with two other settlers, Silas Croft and Jedediah Stone, watching from a respectable distance. "He's lost his mind," Croft muttered, pulling his collar tight against the breeze. "A dirt floor? The man wants his family to freeze on a dirt floor." Pickett shook his head, a wry smile on his face. He was a practical man who understood the physics of wood, of insulation, of survival. What he was seeing made no sense. "It's worse than that, Silas. He told my boy he intends to build a fire on it, right on the floor itself." He gestured toward the cabin, where Florescu's quiet work continued. "He's not just making a floor. The fool is baking it like a loaf of bread. It'll crack to pieces by Christmas, and they'll be living on frozen mud. It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've ever seen a man do." The consensus was swift and unforgiving. The Romanian was crazy. What did this Romanian pottery kiln master, a man who understood the alchemy of earth and fire, know about thermal mass that the most experienced frontier builders, men who had raised 100 cabins, had missed entirely? The answer was buried 18 inches deep in the clay beneath his feet, waiting for the cold to put it to the test. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand the profound and simple science of a heat battery made of earth, a technology our ancestors knew that we have largely forgotten. If you appreciate learning how old-world wisdom solved life-or-death problems, consider subscribing to this channel for more stories of frontier ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used? Constantin Florescu was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor a hunter, nor any of the things a man was supposed to be in the Loess Hills of Iowa. Back in his village nestled in the curvature Carpathians of Romania, he had been a oler, a master of the kiln. His hands, now caked in Iowa mud, were trained to know the language of clay, its plasticity, its memory, its transformation under heat. His world had been one of fire brick, throwing wheels, glazing compounds, and the deep, resonant hum of a kiln at full blaze. He understood that a properly built kiln didn't just heat the pots within. The very structure of the kiln itself, its thick earthen walls, became a vessel for heat. Between firings, when the kiln was cooling over a period of days, the workshop floor, itself made of fired clay, would radiate a gentle, persistent warmth. He had spent his entire life working on floors that remembered fire. He had come to America with his wife, Elena, and their two small children, Stefan and Anka, lured by the promise of land. But the promise of land came with a silent, brutal condition: surviving the winter. Their first year had been a lesson in failure, a slow-motion disaster that had nearly broken them. The cabin they built was identical to their neighbors, a sturdy log box chinked with mud and moss, a testament to frontier convention. But convention was no match for an Iowa winter. The green wood they'd managed to cut hissed and sputtered in the hearth, producing more smoke than heat. By midnight, the warmth from the fire was a distant memory. The cold would creep in, first along the floor, then up the walls. Water in the bucket just feet from the fireplace would be skimmed with ice by morning. Elena had taken to heating rocks in the fire, wrapping them in rags, and placing them at the children's feet, a fleeting comfort that vanished in an hour. By January, the floor planks, poorly seasoned and subjected to the relentless cycle of feeble warmth and deep cold, had begun to warp and cup, creating tripping hazards and new gaps for the wind to knife through. Constantin saw the exhaustion in Elena's face, heard the dry coughs of his children, and knew that doing the same thing again would be an act of insanity. He wouldn't survive another winter like that. His family wouldn't. He didn't need a better axe or more wood. He needed a better idea. And his memory returned to the deep, abiding warmth of his old workshop floor. The failure of the standard frontier cabin wasn't a failure of materials or effort. It was a failure of physics, a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. The settlers of the Loess Hills were fighting a war of attrition against the cold, and they were losing. Their strategy was simple. When you are cold, build a bigger fire. They burned through cords of wood at a shocking rate, the roaring flames in their stone hearths, a desperate, temporary victory against the elements. But the problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the box they were trying to heat. A log cabin is a study in thermal inefficiency. Wood, for all its strength, is a poor insulator and has relatively low thermal mass. A typical 6-inch thick pine log has an R value of about 7. A modern insulated wall has an R value of 19 or more. Heat flowed through the walls with stubborn ease. The chinking between the logs, often just a mixture of mud and grass, would shrink and crack, creating dozens of tiny, invisible drafts that bled warmth out of the room. But the greatest failure, the one Constantine understood, and his neighbors did not, was the floor. A conventional plank floor, raised a few inches off the frozen ground on joists, created a dead airspace underneath. This space, however, was rarely dead. It was alive with cold air that seeped in from outside, chilling the planks from below. The wood itself had almost no capacity to store heat. When the fire roared, the air in the cabin became hot. This hot air rose, as all hot air does, hovering near the ceiling while the floor remained frigid. The moment the fire died down to coals, the stored heat in the room, which was only in the air, dissipated within an hour. The temperature would plummet. At Ward Pickett's house, considered one of the finest in the area, the temperature would drop 20 degrees in the 2 hours after the fire was banked for the night. For families like the Schmidts, who had 4 young children, this meant a nightly ritual of huddling together under every blanket they owned, waking to the sight of their own breath crystallizing in the air. The problem wasn't a lack of heat, it was a lack of heat storage. They were trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Constantine began his work in late September. The first step was destruction. He pried up every plank of the floor he had so painstakingly laid the year before. He dug out the dark, cold soil beneath, going down a full 2 feet, well below the frost line. The neighbors watched this excavation with morbid curiosity. "He's digging his own root cellar," Jedediah Stone remarked to anyone who would listen. "Right in the middle of his house." Then came the clay. He had spent days searching for the right kind, walking the bluffs and creek beds. He found it in a deep vein of loess soil, a fine, silty deposit left by ancient glaciers. It had the perfect consistency, not too sandy, not too heavy. He mixed it in a pit outside his cabin, adding sand for temper and long stalks of prairie grass for binding, much like a potter adds grog to a throwing body to prevent cracking. Elena and even the young Stefan helped, stomping the mixture with their bare feet until it was a uniform, pliable mass. The real work was filling the hole. He laid the clay mixture in 6-inch layers. After each layer, he began to tamp. He used a heavy log, its end cut square, and for days on end, the only sound from the Florescu homestead was the dull, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of wood on earth. It was exhausting, monotonous work. He was compressing the earth, driving out the air, creating a dense, monolithic slab. He was not just filling a hole, he was building a foundation of immense density. Layer after layer, he built it up until the new floor was 18 inches thick, solid and level with the base of the cabin's log walls. The mockery grew louder as the project neared its strange conclusion. Ward Pickett stopped by again, this time with a more pointed technical criticism. "Florescu," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being right. "I run a mill. I know wood. You put that much damp earth against the base logs of this cabin, and you're inviting rot. By spring, your foundation will be spongy as a mushroom. You're building a moisture trap." He pointed a thick finger at the dense gray surface. "And this idea of firing it. You're trying to bake it like bread, but it's too thick. The surface will flash fire, and the moisture deep inside will turn to steam. It'll blow out, crack into 1,000 pieces. You'll have a floor of broken pottery." Constantin paused his tamping, leaning on the heavy log. He wiped a sleeve across his brow. He looked at Pickett, then at his floor. "It will be dry," he said quietly. "The fire will be slow. It will not crack." He offered no further explanation. He simply turned and resumed his work. Thump, thump, thump. The final stage was the most bizarre. Constantin covered the finished, tamped floor with a thin layer of sand. Then he began to build a fire. Not a roaring blaze in the hearth, but a small, carefully controlled fire that he moved across the surface of the floor. For nearly a week, he kept this creeping fire alive slowly, methodically, driving the moisture out of the clay. The cabin filled with a strange, earthy smell, the scent of a pottery kiln during its initial curing. He was not flash firing it, as Pickett had predicted. He was bisque firing it, a long, slow bake that transformed the compressed earth into a single, seamless piece of low-grade ceramic. When it was done, the floor was no longer gray and soft, but a warm, terracotta red, hard as stone, and ringing with a clear tone when struck. He swept it clean, and for the first time his family stood on a floor made of the very hills around them, transformed by fire. Elena looked at him, her expression a mixture of trust and bewilderment. "It feels," she said, placing a hand on the wall, "like we are living inside the hearth." To understand what Constantin had built, you have to understand the simple, elegant physics of thermal mass. Thermal mass is an object's ability to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. Think of the difference between a thin sheet of metal and a heavy stone boulder left out in the sun. The metal heats up instantly, but cools just as fast the moment a cloud passes over. The boulder takes hours to warm up, but once it does, it stays warm long into the cool evening, radiating a gentle heat. The boulder has high thermal mass. The metal sheet does not. A standard frontier cabin was built entirely of low-mass materials: the wooden walls, the plank floor, the very air inside. None of them could hold a significant amount of heat. The energy produced by the fire, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, warmed the air quickly, but it had nowhere to go. As soon as the fire died, the heat radiated out through the walls and roof, and the temperature inside crashed, seeking to equalize with the bitter cold outside. Constantin's floor fundamentally changed this equation. His 18-inch slab of fired, compressed earth was the stone boulder placed inside the cabin. Clay, especially when fired into a dense ceramic-like material, has a specific heat capacity 3 times higher than that of timber. This means a pound of his floor could store 3 times the BTUs as a pound of pine planking, but his floor didn't weigh pounds. It weighed tons. He had installed a massive heat battery, a thermal flywheel, directly into his living space. When he built a fire in his hearth, 2 things happened. The fire heated the air, just as in any other cabin, but it also radiated heat downward, directly onto the floor. For hours, the floor soaked up this energy, thousands upon thousands of BTUs, which in a normal cabin would have simply overheated the air near the ceiling and then escaped, were instead absorbed into the dense clay. The floor became a reservoir of heat, and the release of this heat was just as important. The floor was designed to release its stored energy very slowly. The card specifies a release rate of below 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. So if the floor was heated to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, it would take over 10 hours for it to cool to just 60 degrees Fahrenheit, all the while radiating gentle, even warmth into the room. It transformed the very nature of heat in the cabin. Instead of sharp peaks of scorching heat and deep valleys of freezing cold, the Florescu home now had a stable, consistently comfortable temperature, moderated by the immense, slow-breathing warmth of the earth beneath their feet. It was a system of unparalleled efficiency, powered by the same fire everyone else was using, but capturing the energy they were all letting slip away. That November, winter came to Iowa not with a blizzard, but with a suffocating, silent cold. A high-pressure system settled over the region, and for 17 consecutive days the temperature never rose above -18 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no wind, no snow, just a profound and penetrating stillness. It was a cold that found every crack, every weakness. It was the kind of cold that kills. For the settlers in the Loess Hills, it was a siege. The sound of axes ringing against frozen wood was constant. Smoke billowed from every chimney, a frantic signal of the battle being waged within. At the Croft homestead, the water barrel froze solid, despite being only 5 feet from the hearth. Silas spent his days hauling buckets from the creek, a dangerous, exhausting task. His wife, Mary, kept their 2 youngest in their beds, buried under a mound of quilts, their faces pale and listless. The McCluskeys, who had a newborn, burned through their winter woodpile at a terrifying rate. The inside of their windows were caked with a thick, opaque layer of frost that never melted. They were living in a state of perpetual twilight. Their world shrunk to the small circle of heat cast by a fire that demanded constant feeding. At the Florescu cabin, the world was different. The first few days of the freeze, Constantin kept a modest, steady fire going in the hearth. The clay floor drank in the heat, the surface becoming pleasantly warm to the touch. The air in the single room was cool but not cold, holding at a steady 65 degrees. There were no drafts. The stillness inside mirrored the stillness outside. Then, on the 8th day of the freeze, a Sunday evening, Constantin let the fire die down. He banked the coals as usual, but the next morning he did not add new logs. He simply swept the cold ash from the hearth. Elena watched him, a question in her eyes. "We will see," he said. "We will see what the earth remembers." Monday passed. The temperature outside bottomed out at -22. Inside the Florescu cabin, the air was still comfortable. Anka and Stefan played on the floor, not in their coats, but in their regular woolen clothes. The most remarkable sign of the floor's success was a small, mundane detail. On a small wooden table, a dish of butter Elena had churned remained soft and spreadable. In every other cabin for 100 miles, butter was a frozen, unwieldy brick that had to be chipped at with a knife. Here it was a simple, everyday food, proof that the cold had been defeated. The floor, now the warmest object in the cabin, was radiating a slow, steady, and completely silent heat. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth, the kind you feel from the sun on a spring day, not the harsh, directional heat of a fire. They ate their dinner, the room lit by a single lantern, the silence broken only by the sound of their spoons against their bowls. There was no crackle of flames, no hiss of green wood, just a deep, abiding peace. On Tuesday afternoon, a young man named Billy Thompson, who worked for Ward Pickett at the mill, was making his way home. His route took him past the Florescu claim. Out of habit, he glanced at the chimney. There was no smoke. He'd noticed the same thing on Monday. In the midst of the most brutal cold snap in memory, with every other chimney in the valley belching a constant plume of wood smoke, the Romanian's was still. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. A fire going out in this weather was a death sentence. He thought of the two small children. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching on the brittle snow. He burst into the mill office, his breath coming in white puffs. "Mr. Pickett," he stammered, his face flushed with cold and alarm. "It's the Florescus. There's been no smoke from their chimney. Not yesterday, not today. I think something's wrong." Ward Pickett's heart sank. He had mocked the man, called him a fool, but he had never wished him ill. The thought of an entire family frozen in their beds because of one man's stubborn foolishness was horrifying. "Get your coat, Billy," he said, his voice grim. "We're going over." The walk was short, but felt like a journey to a tomb. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. Pickett's mind raced, rehearsing the grim discovery he was about to make. He imagined breaking down the door to find a scene of silent tragedy. He steeled himself. As they approached the cabin, he saw no light in the windows, heard no sound from within. This was it. He raised a heavy, gloved fist and knocked on the door. The sound was unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. He waited. Nothing. He was about to knock again, harder this time, when the door swung inward. Constantin Florescu stood there, holding a book. He was wearing a simple woolen shirt. He did not look like a man fighting for his life. He looked calm, comfortable. And from the open door, a wave of warmth washed over Pickett's face. It wasn't the searing, dry heat of a desperate, roaring fire. It was a gentle, humid warmth, steady and encompassing. It was impossible. "Florescu," Pickett said, his voice hoarse. "Your fire?" Billy said he saw no smoke. "The fire is out," Constantin said simply, stepping aside to let him in. Pickett entered the cabin, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The first thing he saw was the hearth. It was dark. Utterly, completely dark and empty. He strode over to it and looked down. The ash was gray and cold, stirred by the draft from the open door. There wasn't a single glowing ember. He looked at Constantin, then at his wife and children, who were sitting at the table reading. They were fine. They were warm. It defied every law of nature he knew. "When?" Pickett asked, his voice barely a whisper. "When did you last have a fire?" "Sunday night," Constantin replied. "We let it go out Sunday night." It was now late Tuesday afternoon. 38 hours. Pickett felt a sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground of his own experience had turned to water. He stared at the floor, the source of his ridicule, the great foolish, baked clay experiment. It had to be the source of the warmth. There was no other explanation. Slowly, as if in a trance, he knelt down. He pulled off his thick leather glove, his fingers stiff with the cold from the walkover. He expected to feel a surface that was cool, or perhaps impossibly, retaining a faint, ghostly trace of heat. He laid his bare palm flat against the hard, reddish-brown surface of the clay. The shock was electric. The floor was not cold. It was not cool. It was warm. a deep, penetrating, living warmth that seemed to rise from the very core of the earth. It was the temperature of a living thing. He pressed his hand harder, feeling the stable, radiant heat flow into his frozen skin. The gap between what he knew to be possible and what he was feeling was absolute. In that moment, his entire understanding of the world, built on a lifetime of practical, hard-won experience, was shattered and remade. He looked up at the quiet Romanian whose foolishness had now been revealed as a form of genius so profound it was almost terrifying. All of his confident pronouncements, his technical objections, his casual mockery turned to ash in his mouth. He finally understood. Constantin hadn't just built a floor. He had built something else entirely. "You didn't build a floor," Pickett said, his voice filled with a new and unfamiliar awe. "You taught the earth to remember the fire." The conversion of Ward Pickett was as swift as it was total. He went from being the community's loudest critic to its most fervent evangelist. The very next day, he brought the 5-man committee of the Loess Hills Agricultural Society to the Florescu cabin. He made them take off their boots. He made them put their hands on the floor. He made them stand in silence and feel the impossible, steady warmth rising from a cabin with a dead hearth in the middle of a record-breaking freeze. There were no more jokes about baking bread. There was only a stunned, respectful silence followed by a torrent of questions. Constantin, a man of few words, answered them simply. He explained the mix: 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part straw. He described the tamping, the importance of compression. He detailed the slow, creeping fire used for curing. The men of the society, practical farmers and builders, took meticulous notes. They measured the thickness of the floor. They recorded the formula. This wasn't some strange foreign magic. It was a process, a recipe that could be followed. That spring, after the great freeze finally broke, 4 new cabins were built in the surrounding townships. None of them had wooden floors. Under Ward Pickett's guidance, they all incorporated the Florescu floor. The results were immediate and dramatic. Families that had burned through 10 cords of wood to survive the previous winter now found that 4 were more than sufficient. The savings in labor, in time, in the sheer physical misery of a frontier winter were immeasurable. The technique spread through the social network of the frontier, not by books or newspapers, but by word of mouth, by demonstration, by one farmer showing another the undeniable proof of a warm home. The Agricultural Society published the details in their yearly almanac, and the crazy Romanian's idea became the new standard for intelligent frontier construction. What Constantin Florescu did in 1879 was revolutionary, yet it was an echo of ancient practices. He had, without formal training in thermodynamics, created a near-perfect system of passive heat modulation. Today we have names for these concepts. His floor is a form of radiant slab heating. The principle of using dense materials to store solar or ambient heat is the cornerstone of passive solar design. Modern eco-friendly homes often use thick concrete floors or stone walls precisely for their thermal mass, allowing them to absorb the sun's heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. Constantin was a century ahead of his time. He didn't have charts of specific heat capacities or formulas for calculating BTU storage. He had something more elemental, a tactile, intuitive understanding of materials forged in the heat of a kiln. He knew how Earth behaved when it met fire, and he used that knowledge not to create a delicate piece of pottery, but to create a rugged, livable, and profoundly efficient home. His work stands as a testament to the fact that the most advanced principles of building science are often rediscoveries of knowledge that traditional craftspeople have held for generations. The true genius of Constantin's floor was a philosophical one. The frontier mindset was one of relentless action, of constant brute force struggle against nature. If you were cold, you chopped more wood and built a bigger fire. It was a battle of consumption. The Florescu floor represented a paradigm shift. It suggested that the goal wasn't to produce more heat, but to wisely conserve the heat you already had. It was a system built on patience, on storage, on memory. The floor that remembered the fire made the ceaseless stoking of that fire unnecessary. It offered not just warmth, but peace. It replaced the frantic, exhausting labor of winter survival with a quiet, abiding comfort, proving that sometimes the most powerful innovations aren't about adding more, but about intelligently holding on to what is precious. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of thermal mass and historical building techniques valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What piece of forgotten technology do you think deserves to be rediscovered today? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.